welcome to Friends Residency, the ultimate app for MD students preparing for the MDMS university examinations. I'm Dr. Riya Mitra, your faculty for physiology. Today I'll be guiding you through the topic of action potential and resting membrane potential. So let us begin. First off, we look into what is resting membrane potential. Now let us dissect this resting membrane potential first into resting and the membrane potential. So what is membrane potential? Membrane, as you understand, is nothing but the cell membrane. It is the division of charges, which can be positive charges or negative charges across the cell membrane. This here is my cell membrane, and it is the division of charges across the cell membrane, because of which it is known as membrane potential. Now for this membrane potential, there is requirement of two special properties. One is concentration gradient, and second is the permeability of the membrane. What do you understand by concentration gradient? Concentration gradient is the division of charges because of the presence of ions, right? Now, for the concentration gradient to be present, there has to be unequal distribution of ions on the either side of the cell membrane. And these ions should be permeable through the cell membrane. That is, cell membrane should permeate these ions to be transported from one side of the membrane to the other side. Now, because of these factors, there will be a formation of charges across the membrane, which is known as the membrane potential. Now, what is resting membrane potential? Resting membrane potential is the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane at rest. Most neurons have a resting membrane potential of -60 to -70 millivolt. In case of neurons, we generally consider it to be -70 millivolt. Now, what are the factors which can be responsible for resting membrane potential? Now, the resting membrane potential is primarily determined by potassium equilibrium potential, sodium potassium ATPase, or leak channels. Now, why potassium? We see the common factor in all of them is potassium, right? Now, why is it that potassium is more responsible for resting membrane potential? One simple explanation for is it that at rest, the number of potassium channels that are permeable to potassium are more in number than the open sodium channels which allow the movement of sodium. That is, at rest, the number of channels that are open for potassium is more than the number of channels that are open for sodium, right? So, open channels for potassium are more than open channels for sodium, because of which the resting membrane potential is more dependent on potassium than any other ion, not even sodium and not even chloride. Then, what is the function of this sodium potassium ATPase? We know that the sodium potassium ATPase, it actively maintains a high intracellular potassium and low intracellular sodium concentration by pumping 3 sodium out and 2 potassium inside the cell, which contributes to the negative intracellular charges. You see, 3 sodiums, they are taken out, and 2 potassium, they are brought in. So more amount of positive charge is leaving the cell membrane, because of which there will be accumulation of negative intracellular charges. Supposingly, if we have to draw a cell membrane, this here is my cell membrane, this here is the ECF, and this is the intracellular fluid. Then what did I just say? I said there will be accumulation of negative charges inside the membrane, while there will be positive charges outside the cell membrane, right? This will give rise to the resting membrane potential. Now, there are certain equations which help you to calculate resting membrane potential, one of which is Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation. Before we see what is Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation, there is another equation which is known as Nernst equation or Nernst potential. Now, what is Nernst equation? The Nernst equation or Nernst potential is given by RT upon ZF natural log of the concentration of the ion outside upon concentration of the ion inside, right? Now, what is R? R is the natural gas constant. What is T? It is absolute temperature. Z is nothing but the valency of the ions which we are using in the calculation of Nernst equation. And what is F? F is Faraday constant. And 1 Faraday is equal to 96,500 coulombs, right? Then natural log of the concentration of the ion outside and the concentration of the ion inside. Now this RT upon ZF, it can be calculated as a constant value of approximately 61.5 with log. And supposingly we take potassium as an example, we know that the concentration of potassium outside is less. Supposingly it is 4 and the concentration of potassium inside is higher. In this case, if it is considered to be 155, then you will get that the equilibrium potential for potassium is approximately minus 90 millivolt. Now, using this same formula of Nernst equation, you can also calculate the equilibrium potential for sodium. Then you would find out that the equilibrium potential for sodium is approximately plus 60 millivolt. And what did I say? The equilibrium potential for potassium is minus 90 millivolt. And in the beginning of the discussion, we saw that the resting membrane potential is approximately between minus 60 to minus 70 millivolt, right? So you can appreciate that the resting membrane potential is closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium, that is minus 90 millivolt, and it is not close to the equilibrium potential of sodium, which is plus 60 millivolt. Now, a combination of this Nernst equation is the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation. Let me quickly erase this here. The resting membrane potential can be calculated using the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation, which incorporates the relative permeabilities of sodium, potassium, and chloride. Now, what do you see here? It is the membrane potential denoted by Em. R is the gas constant. T is absolute temperature. F is Faraday's constant. Z here is 1 because the valency for potassium is 1. For sodium also it is 1 and for chloride also it is 1. And F is the Faraday's constant. Natural log of concentration of potassium outside and concentration of potassium inside plus concentration of sodium outside, concentration of sodium inside, concentration of chloride inside and concentration of chloride outside. Because of the negative valency of the chloride, this one here is reversed, right? And this one, pK or PNA, these are the conductance coefficient constant. Right, these are a constant based on their conductance. As you can see, Pp is the permeability of the ions based on the intracellular and extracellular concentration. Now let us move on to action potential. Action potential is a transient, rapid depolarization and repolarization of the membrane potential in response to a stimulus that reaches threshold. It propagates without decrement along the excitable membranes, right? Now, what are the phases of action potential? Let us first draw a graph of action potential here. This graph here depicts the action potential. Now, let me draw it properly. I'll mark this as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 and phase 4, right? This phase 1 here is the resting phase. What is the resting phase? Resting phase is also known as the latent phase. Now, once a stimulus for depolarization arrives, there is opening of the activation gate of the sodium channels. We are aware that sodium channels have two types of gate. They have an activation gate and they have a inactivation gate. What are these? These are sodium channels, right? Now the activation gates, they open quickly whenever there is arrival of a stimulus for depolarization. The inactivation gates, they also begin to open as soon as the stimulus arrives, but the difference is that they are slow. That is, they close slowly, while the activation gates, they are faster. So whenever there is appearance of a stimulus, the activation gates, they open quickly, while the inactivation gates, they also begin to get closed, but they move much slower than the activation gates, because of which the resting membrane potential, which we know is approximately minus 70 millivolt, is slowly increased or more slowly moves towards the threshold. The threshold is approximately minus 55 millivolt. Once the membrane potential changes from the resting potential to the threshold potential of minus 55 millivolt, there is opening of increased number of sodium channels by positive feedback. As more and more sodium channels open, there is increase in the membrane potential, and you can see this as the sharp uprise, right? You can appreciate the sharp upstroke. This phase is marked as 2. Now here you can also see that the membrane potential is trying to reach the equilibrium potential of sodium. What is the equilibrium potential of sodium? That is plus 60 millivolt. This curve is moving towards positivity and is trying to match the equilibrium potential of sodium, but it cannot do so because at the peak, what happens? The inactivation gates get closed. The inactivation, which has started at this phase, finally gets inactivated by the time it reaches here, and also at this point, more number of potassium channels start opening up. Now when the potassium channels are opened, what happens? There is increased efflux of potassium. There is efflux of potassium. Because of efflux of potassium, positive charges are moving outside. The membrane potential slowly moves back to its resting membrane potential. Now since the potassium channels are also slow, because of which there will be a phase of hyperpolarization. What is hyperpolarization? Hyperpolarization is the phase when the membrane potential has fallen and has become more negative than the resting membrane potential. During this phase, it will be more difficult for the action potential to generate, or stimulus to generate an action potential, right? This is known as hyperpolarization. So during threshold and depolarization, a stimulus depolarizes the membrane to the threshold potential, which is approximately minus 55 millivolt. The voltage gate is sodium channels open, causing sodium influx. In the repolarization, the sodium channels get inactivated. These are because of the time-dependent inactivation gate, right? The voltage gated sodium channels, they open, causing potassium efflux, restoring the negativity. In after hyperpolarization, or which is also known as hyperpolarization, the potassium channels remain open longer than necessary, resulting in transient hyperpolarization below the resting membrane potential. The membrane gradually returns to resting membrane potential as potassium channel closes. Refractory period are of two types. It can be absolute refractory period or relative refractory period. Now absolute refractory period, if I have to mark it on the graph, will be from the beginning of the action potential till the completion of 1/3 part of the repolarization, right? From beginning of action potential till the completion of 1/3 portion of repolarization, and this is known as the absolute refractory period. During absolute refractory period, no new action potential can be generated regardless of the stimulus strength. No matter how strong the stimulus, action potential cannot be generated if the stimulus reaches the neuron during this phase of the action potential. Here it is because the sodium channels are inactivated. We know that we need the sodium channels to open for the influx of sodium for the upstroke of the action potential. Here the sodium channels are inactivated, because of which the new stimulus will not act. What is relative refractory period? A stronger than normal stimulus can evoke an action potential. Some sodium channels have recovered. Now, what was the cause of absolute refractory period? Sodium channels were inactivated, but in relative refractory period, some of the sodium channels have recovered, but potassium efflux continues to oppose the depolarization, right? Now, if we see the ionic basis of action potential, we have already discussed it, but let us revise. The sodium channels are responsible for the depolarization phase. They have two gates, fast activation gates, right? They have two gates, fast activation gate and slow inactivation gate. This is fast activation gate and slow time dependent inactivation gate. What are potassium channels? Potassium channels are mediators of repolarization and they open more slowly than the sodium channels. Now, quickly coming to the relevance of action potential and resting membrane potential to physiology and pathophysiology. Now, whenever you get a question on action potential or resting membrane potential, you know the headings you have to cover it under, right? You have to first look for the definition. You have to first define what is action potential or what is action membrane potential. Then you have to discuss the Nernst equation and the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation. Then you have to draw a graph for the action potential and describe the different phases of action potential, right? Then you have to discuss about the refractory periods, the causes, and you have to mark them on the graph as well. And you again have to discuss about the ionic basis of the action potential. And finally, you have to end your answer with its importance, clinical significance, and its relevance in physiology or pathophysiology, right? Now, coming to action potential and resting membrane potential, the relevance is in neurotransmission. Action potential, they enable synaptic signaling. Muscle contraction, action potentials in the skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle trigger the contraction mechanism. Next is pathological alterations. Abnormal resting membrane potential or action potential properties can lead to conditions such as epilepsy, arrhythmia, or channelopathies. Thank you so much for learning physiology with me today. For more updated and high-edge topics, please follow the Friends Residency app. You'll have the description of the app. You'll get the link of description. Thank you so much for learning physiology with me today. Please download the Friends Residency app. You'll get the link in the description. Please follow the app and share it with more of your fellow residents. And subscribe to the app